She was left behind, like a forgotten shadow in the dust, a young woman who couldn't hear the world, and a father too broken to care. But when a lonely single dad stepped in to save her, he uncovered something no one else had seen. She didn't just hear with her ears. She listened with her soul. If you believe in second chances, quiet miracles, and the kind of love that speaks louder than words, subscribe now and stay with us through a story that just might stay with you long after the final word. Now let me take you back to the moment it all began. Texas, 1881. The sky was white with heat, the kind that made the wooden fences groan, and the air shimmer like a fevered dream. Dust rose in steady swirls from the parched dirt road as Reuben Hale guided his old wagon toward the Whispering Creek livestock yard. His shirt clung to his back, sweat tracing the long line of his spine, but he didn't mind. Work was honest. Work didn't lie. The thud of hooves and the distant bawling of cattle welcomed him as he approached the sun-scorched corrals. The men working the pens moved like shadows, their hats low against the glare. Reuben had come to trade lumber for feed, a routine deal with the foreman. But today, he wouldn't make it past the fence. Something stopped him. A sharp voice, a shout, then silence. He turned his head just in time to see a girl no older than 19 stumble backward from a thick-set man in a sweat-soaked shirt. Her long brown hair was matted, her cheeks flushed red from the heat. Her arms flailed momentarily, searching, as if the ground beneath her had vanished. Useless, the man barked, his voice thick with whiskey and venom. I'm done. Let someone else feed your sorry soul. He yanked a small canvas satchel from her hands and hurled it into the dirt. The girl dropped to her knees, not from the blow, but from confusion, disorientation. She moved oddly, as if reacting to vibrations rather than sound. Reuben jumped off the wagon before he knew what he was doing. Every instinct in him honed over 45 years of loss. Silence and stubborn faith roared to life. The man noticed him. Back off, mister. She ain't yours. She a criminal, Reuben's voice was low and steady. She's mine, the man said, pointing to the girl as if she were a broken tool. Or she was. Deaf, dumb, good for nothing. Not my fault she's cursed. Reuben's fists clenched. The girl still knelt in the dirt, her hands trembling, her face lifted toward the soundless sun. She wasn't crying. She didn't even blink. But there was something in the line of her shoulders, a rigid kind of dignity that made Reuben feel like the world had just tipped sideways. You don't leave a child in the dust like that, Reuben said quietly. She ain't a child. She's 19. And she ain't my problem anymore. The man turned, spat into the dirt, and climbed into his truck. As the engine roared and the vehicle tore off into a cloud of dust, Reuben stood motionless. The girl didn't move. Slowly he approached her. He bent down and touched her shoulder gently. She flinched, but not like someone afraid. It was more like she was adjusting to a frequency only she could feel. He knelt beside her. My name's Reuben, he said, even though he knew she couldn't hear. She looked at him, wide eyes filled with heat and something deeper, something ancient and unreadable. He pointed to himself again. Reuben. Then he mimed writing and pointed to the satchel. She blinked, then reached for the bag, fingers moving with a quiet grace. She pulled out a small leather-bound notebook and scratched something on the page. Iris. Just a name. But it was enough. Reuben nodded and offered his hand. For a moment, Iris hesitated. Then she placed her palm in his light as air. He led her to the wagon. Silas, his 13-year-old son, was waiting in the shade of a feed tower, wide-eyed. She coming with us? Silas asked. She is, now Reuben said. Why? Reuben paused. Because no one deserves to be left behind in the heat like that. Because sometimes silence says more than shouting ever will. Silas nodded like he didn't understand, but maybe he did more than he knew. As the wagon rolled out of the yard, Iris sat with her hands in her lap, her face turned to the wind, the sun catching the edge of her profile. She didn't speak. She didn't hear the creak of the wagon or the birds crying overhead. But something about her felt listening. Alive, attuned. Reuben didn't understand it. Not yet. But something deep in his chest, a place he hadn't felt stir in years, began to hum. And for the first time since his wife died, Reuben Hale felt like he wasn't just moving forward. He was being led. The road back to the Hale Ranch was long and sun-bleached, winding through flatlands dotted with mesquite and cactus, past the weather-worn bones of old fence posts and dry creeks that whispered only in memory. Reuben held the reins in silence, aware of the weight, emotional more than physical, sitting beside him. Iris. She hadn't spoken since climbing into the wagon, hadn't signed, hadn't smiled. But he felt her presence as vividly as he had ever felt thunder on his skin. She sat straight eyes scanning the horizon, as though the landscape spoke in frequencies he could not fathom. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white. He didn't ask questions. He didn't push. He simply let the horses move at their own steady rhythm, while the silence between them grew comfortable. Silas had glanced back at her more than once, curious but quiet, which for him was remarkable. The boy had inherited his mother's spirit, all restless energy and sharp questions. But now he kept his thoughts to himself, sensing perhaps that this moment was not meant to be filled with noise. By the time they arrived at the ranch, the sun was beginning its descent, casting long golden streaks across the dry grass. The house, a 2-bedroom timber frame with peeling paint and a wide front porch, sat nestled among a small grove of cottonwoods. It was humble but clean, and carried the scent of pine smoke, old books, and the faintest trace of lavender, a scent Reuben had never been able to part with since the day Abigail passed. He helped Iris down from the wagon. She moved slowly, warily, like someone stepping into a dream they weren't sure they could trust. She took in the porch, the horses, the stacked firewood. Her gaze lingered on the rocking chair that still creaked when the wind was right. "Come on," Reuben said gently, holding open the door. Iris stepped inside. She paused just beyond the threshold, her feet rooted to the wooden floor as her eyes scanned the room. Everything inside was well-worn, but welcoming shelves lined with books and hand-carved figures, a fireplace with ash still soft from the morning's embers, a table set for 3, even though it had only seated 2 for years. She took a tentative step forward, her hand brushing the edge of a worn armchair. Then she turned, as if unsure. "It's yours," Reuben said, "as long as you want it." She didn't reply, but she nodded barely, and that was more than he expected. That evening, Reuben cooked beans and skillet bread, the same simple meal he'd made since Abigail's passing. Iris ate slowly, silently. Silas devoured his portion with less ceremony, but kept casting glances toward the girl at the table. Her silence wasn't awkward. It was deliberate, introspective, like she was storing every flavor, every detail deep within her. After dinner, Reuben showed her to the spare room. It had once been Abigail's sewing room, then a place for storage, then nothing at all. Now, with fresh sheets and the window cracked to let in the breeze, it felt like it had been waiting for her all along. He pointed to the dresser, the basin, the hooks on the wall. She watched attentively. Then she pulled out her notebook, wrote a single word, and held it out. "Thank you." His throat tightened. He hadn't realized until that moment how long it had been since someone said those words to him and meant them. "You're welcome," he said, then paused. "I'm glad you're here." She gave the smallest smile, then closed the door. Reuben stood in the hallway for a long moment afterward, listening not for sound, but for presence. He felt the quiet settle not like absence, but like rest, like a weight being gently lifted. Later that night, he sat on the porch while Silas fed the dogs and closed up the barn. The stars above the Texas sky blinked to life, indifferent but constant. Silas joined him sitting on the steps with his boots untied and his elbows on his knees. "Is she staying?" he asked. "For now," Reuben said. "She's not like anyone I've met." "No," Reuben said. "She's not. Do you think she's special?" Reuben looked out into the dark, his gaze settling somewhere between memory and hope. "I think," he said slowly, "she sees more than we do, even without sound." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Do you think she can hear us in a different way?" Reuben smiled, a slow, thoughtful thing. "I think she already has." Inside the house, Iris lay in bed, with the window open, the wind brushing her cheek like a whisper. She could not hear the crickets or the shifting of the trees, but she felt the rhythm of the night in the vibrations of the floorboards, the heartbeat of the earth below, and the fading tension in the walls. She pressed her palm flat against the wooden headboard, and something inside her unclenched. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she believed it might be something worth staying for. The morning came with a slow burn across the horizon, turning the pale Texas sky to gold. Reuben was already in the barn by the time the rooster crowed, not because he had to be, but because he'd slept lightly, as he often did these days. Old habits from grief didn't die easily. He was brushing down the older of his two geldings, Boone, when he heard the creak of the porch floorboards. A quick glance through the open barn doors confirmed what he suspected. Iris. She stood barefoot on the edge of the steps, hair braided down her back, wearing one of Abigail's old linen dresses that Silas had fished out of a trunk the night before. It hung slightly off her shoulders, but she looked right, as if she belonged there like the cottonwoods or the early light. She moved cautiously across the yard, arms tucked into her sides. She wasn't lost, but hesitant, like someone stepping into a song she couldn't quite hum along to. Reuben stepped outside, gently wiping his hands on a rag. "You're up early," he said. Then quickly added, "I know you can't hear me." "Habit." Iris smiled softly and reached for the small notebook she kept tucked into the waistband of her skirt. She scribbled something quickly and handed it to him. "I like the smell of horses in the morning." Reuben chuckled, holding the note in his calloused fingers. "Then you're in the right place," he said, nodding toward the barn. "Want to help?" She followed him in. It was the first time anyone had stepped into that space with him since Abigail died. Even Silas, for all his energy, stayed clear during chores, unless asked. Reuben handed her a brush. She took it, her hands moving with surprising confidence as she approached Boone. But then something strange happened. The horse flinched, not from fear, but from an awareness that reached deeper. Boone turned his head, looked at Iris, and froze. His ears twitched. His body, usually tense with age, slowly relaxed. Iris stepped forward, raised her hand, and pressed her palm gently against his neck. Boone exhaled, a deep, resonant sigh. Reuben stood back, something in his chest, tightening in a way he hadn't expected. "I've had that horse for 12 years, he murmured. "He won't let anyone but me near him when he's hurting." Iris didn't look at him. She just kept her hand on Boone, eyes closed now, as if she were feeling something the rest of them had missed. That's when it clicked. She wasn't just calming him, she was listening, not with ears, with something else entirely. After a moment, Iris stepped back. She scribbled again in her notebook and passed it to Reuben. His back left leg hurts. Something deep. Maybe the bone, Reuben blinked. He walked to Boone, ran his hands down the hind leg and paused at the fetlock. Swollen, not enough to notice with the eye. Not yet. But it was there, tenderness beneath the skin. He looked at her. How'd you know that Iris only shrugged and smiled? That afternoon, Reuben took Boone to Doc Heller in town. The diagnosis, a small fracture beginning to form from strain. Had they caught it later, it could have crippled him. You're lucky, Heller said. No, Reuben said quietly. I have help. Back at the ranch, Silas was waiting on the porch with a battered book under one arm and a bowl of apples in the other. She's out back, he said, gesturing. Told her she could sit under the tree. She likes the wind. Reuben found Iris beneath the large cottonwood behind the barn, her notebook open on her lap. She didn't see him at first. Her eyes were closed, her fingers tracing the grain of the paper slowly, like a blind musician learning a new instrument. He stood quietly, not wanting to interrupt. Then, remembering, he tapped the ground with his boot twice solidly. She opened her eyes and smiled. It was their signal now. A small one, but it was growing. I took Boone in, he said, kneeling beside her. You were right. She looked pleased, but not surprised. I think you've got a gift, he added, not just with animals. Iris hesitated, then wrote something down and handed it to him. Sometimes I feel people too. Their sorrow, like an ache I didn't earn but still carry. Reuben swallowed hard. That's a heavy thing. She nodded slowly. Must have been lonely? She nodded again. He sat beside her, letting the breeze move through the trees above them. He didn't speak further. He didn't need to. Because that afternoon, for the first time since Iris arrived, the silence between them wasn't filled with fear or uncertainty. It was filled with understanding. Whispering Creek was the kind of town where nothing went unnoticed, especially not a stranger, and certainly not one like Iris Dane. By the end of her third week on the Hale Ranch, whispers had begun drifting from the dusty storefronts and church pews, carried along the same wind that rustled the cottonwoods and scattered seed across dry earth. Who is she? That's Reuben Hale's girl now. They say she can't speak or hear, but she knows things. Feels them. Like a witch. No, just different. Real different. Reuben heard it all not directly, but through the subtle shifts in tone when he walked into Danner's feed store, or the way Mrs. Lorna at the church bake sale avoided his eyes. It didn't surprise him. Whispering Creek had a long memory and a short tolerance for change, but he hadn't expected it to bother Iris. She didn't flinch when people stared. She didn't look away when children pointed, or when grown men lowered their voices. Instead, she watched them, eyes calm, wide open, and impossibly steady, like she had seen this all before, and somehow forgiven it. It was Clara Bell who broke the pattern. Widowed at 30, childless at 52, Clara had taught in the town schoolhouse for nearly 3 decades. She was sharp, dry-humored, and wore black even in the middle of July. She appeared at the Hale porch one Sunday afternoon in a pressed gray dress, her graying hair pulled back into a severe bun. I'm not here to pry, she said flatly when Reuben opened the door. I heard about the girl. I'd like to meet her. Reuben hesitated. You come as a neighbor or a judge? Clara's mouth twitched. Maybe a bit of both. He stepped aside. She's in the back garden. Clara walked through the house like a woman who didn't need permission, stopping at the threshold of the back porch. Iris sat near the herb bed, knees tucked beneath her skirt, humming quietly, not audibly, but with her fingers tracing invisible notes into the soil. Clara didn't say a word. She sat down on the steps and waited. After several minutes, Iris turned, tilting her head slightly. She didn't smile, didn't shrink away. She simply observed. Clara raised her hand slowly in greeting, then reached into her satchel and pulled out a tattered book, Aesop's Fables embossed in gold, the spine nearly gone. She held it up and tapped the cover twice. Iris watched. Then, with delicate motion, she crawled forward and laid her hand over the book. They stayed like that, palm to leather, for nearly a full minute, and something passed between them. Later, Reuben watched from the porch as Clara emerged from the house, the book still in her hand. She didn't speak. She said, adjusting her spectacles. "She can't," Reuben replied. "Oh, but she says plenty," Clara murmured. "She told me I needed to come out of the shadows." Reuben blinked. Did she write that number? Clara's voice trembled for the first time in years. She just looked at me, and I remembered. From that day on, Clara began visiting twice a week. She brought old readers and slates, picture books and string. She never once pitied Iris, never once treated her like glass. She spoke aloud, loudly and clearly, while also learning the slow, graceful rhythm of Iris's hands, a vocabulary built from stillness and empathy. "She's not just deaf," Clara told Reuben one evening. "She's listening on another level. Most of us," she paused, "we're drowning in noise. Iris, she hears what matters." One morning, as Reuben and Silas loaded tools into the wagon, Iris emerged from the house, holding a folded piece of paper. She handed it to Reuben. "There's a boy in town who cries every morning before school. He hides it well, but it's there. Something's wrong." Reuben raised a brow. "Who told you that Iris simply touched 2 fingers to her chest and then extended them outward, like light moving from within?" "You felt it." She nodded. That afternoon, Reuben drove into town and asked around subtly. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. Young Elijah Carter had been sleeping in the church cellar since his mother passed. His father had run off, and the boy hadn't told anyone, afraid he'd be taken away. By sunset, Elijah was eating stew at the Hale table, his feet swinging above the floor, Iris sitting beside him with a quiet smile. Silas gave him a nudge. "You can stay here. My dad won't say no." Reuben didn't. Later that night, as the oil lamp flickered low, Reuben stepped outside and sat on the porch steps, elbows on his knees. Iris joined him moments later, bare feet silent against the boards. He glanced at her. "You saw him before I even knew he existed." She wrote something on a scrap of paper and passed it to him. Sometimes pain travels louder than words. He folded the note, placed it in his shirt pocket, and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I used to think I understood silence," he said softly. "But you make it sacred." She didn't respond with a gesture or a note. She simply leaned her head against his shoulder, the weight feather-light but grounding. And there, beneath the sweeping stars and the endless whisper of wind, Reuben Hale, once hollowed out by loss, felt something bloom quietly in the scarred fields of his heart. Hope. Reuben hadn't set foot in Abigail's sewing room since the day he folded her last unfinished hem and tucked it along with her scissors and pins into the cedar trunk by the window. Dust had gathered along the windowsill, and time had folded itself into the curtains, but the memory of her presence never faded. It clung to the wood grain. It breathed in the linen. It waited. That room had become Iris's, now repainted, aired out, softened by her careful hands. She had never asked to claim it. She had simply filled the space with her quiet rituals, cleaning in the early hours, pressing dried flowers into pages, brushing her fingers over the threads of the old quilts, as if reading their history by touch. Reuben watched her from the hallway that evening, his shoulder resting against the doorframe. Inside, she was rearranging books on the shelf, moving them not by title or subject, but by color. Her face was calm, her movements deliberate, peaceful. But Reuben was not peaceful. He held something in his hands, a photograph, curled at the edges, worn from time, a black and white image of a woman with kind eyes and a soft smile holding a baby boy no more than a year old. Abigail and Silas. He didn't know why he'd brought it out. Maybe because he hadn't looked at it in months. Maybe because Iris, without knowing, had opened doors inside him that had long remained shut. He knocked on the open door. Iris turned and smiled, the kind of smile that acknowledged someone's presence entirely. She gestured to the photograph with curious eyes. Reuben stepped forward and offered it to her. "My wife," he said. "Abigail." Iris took the photo with great care, her thumb smoothing the corners as if smoothing time. She studied it, then looked back at him. No words. Just waiting. "She died of pneumonia," he said softly. 2 winters ago. She got sick fast. I couldn't stop it. I thought I had time. But you never have enough." He sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't cry," he added. "Not then. Not at the funeral. Not after." Iris sat beside him. She didn't touch him, didn't interrupt with a note or gesture. He appreciated that. Silence, when shared with someone who understood, it could feel like permission to finally speak. "I threw out the medicine first, then the scarves she used to wear, then the kettle she liked. It felt like, if I erased the reminders, maybe I could breathe again." He let out a shaky laugh. "Turns out you can't bury grief under old dishcloths." Iris reached for her notebook and wrote only 2 words. "Did it help?" Reuben stared at the paper. "No," he said. "Not even close." He looked at her, really looked, and saw in her eyes the reflection of his own grief. Not identical, not mirrored, but known. "You've lost someone too." She nodded. He didn't press. He didn't need to know the names. Then she wrote again. "I still feel them sometimes. Not as ghosts, as echoes." He breathed in sharply. "Yeah," he said. "That's what it's like. Echoes." They sat there as the twilight thickened outside the window, the room dimming until only the soft amber of a single lantern lit their faces. It was then that Iris rose and walked over to the cedar trunk. Reuben tensed. That trunk had remained shut untouched for 2 years. Even Silas knew not to open it. But Iris didn't open it. She knelt before it, placed both hands flat on the wood, and closed her eyes. For a long moment she stayed that way, as if in prayer, as if listening. When she opened her eyes again, there were tears in them, not of fear, not even of sadness, but of connection. She stood, returned to the bed, and handed Reuben a final note. She loved deeply. That never dies. He swallowed hard. The note trembled slightly in his hand. "You feel everything, don't you?" Iris nodded. Then, for the first time since coming to the ranch, she reached out and placed her hand gently on his heart. Not romantic, not dramatic, just human. And in that simple act, a quiet hand over a long-buried ache, Reuben Hale broke. Not loudly, not with sobs, but with tears that came unbidden and silent, slipping down his face, like rain on hardened soil. He wept for Abigail, for the years lost in quiet suffering, for the moments stolen by fear and pride. And through it all, Iris remained beside him, not speaking, not soothing, just being. That night Reuben didn't dream, but he woke with something he hadn't felt in years. Lightness, not the absence of pain, but the presence of healing. The tension arrived quietly, like a change in barometric pressure. No thunderclap, no wind, just a heaviness that settled into the air and made every word feel like it needed to be whispered. It began with a cough, a small boy, Jesse Ledlow, age 7, son of Mary Ledlow, the seamstress who ran the dry goods store. The cough had lingered for days, grown sharp and wet. The doctor was out of town, called away to assist in a birth on a ranch 2 counties over. Mary did what mothers do. She fretted. She wrapped his chest in cloths soaked with eucalyptus. She stayed up nights holding his hand. Then one morning she saw Iris. Iris had come into town with Clara Bell, walking quietly behind her mentor hands, clasped at her waist, eyes alert. Mary caught a glimpse of her on the porch of the general store, watching the town with her usual unreadable calm, and something inside Mary clenched. Hours later, Jessie's fever spiked. It was a coincidence, but in towns like Whispering Creek, fear didn't need logic, it only needed timing. By the following Sunday, murmurs had become murmurs with names. She was watching the boy someone whispered in the churchyard. Sick the same night, another added. Ain't right, that girl. She feels things, don't she? Maybe she puts things in too. Reuben knew something was wrong the moment he stepped into town. The conversation stopped too abruptly. The glances lingered too long. Even the pastor offered only a curt nod instead of his usual handshake. He kept his back straight, his jaw set. Silas noticed it too. They're talking about Iris, he muttered. Aren't they? Reuben didn't answer. It wasn't until they reached the bakery that it became impossible to ignore. Mary Ledlow stood on the steps, arms folded across her apron, eyes red from more than just exhaustion. She stepped forward not aggressively, but with the brittle energy of someone who had held something in too long. Mr. Hale, she said tightly. Reuben nodded. Mary. Your girl. She said she shouldn't be in town. Reuben froze. Silas's head snapped toward her. Excuse me, Reuben said evenly. I don't mean disrespect. But Jessie's sick, and she was watching him. I saw her. Mary's voice wavered, then hardened. Iris. That girl. She's not normal. She's not contagious either, Reuben said, voice low but firm. I'm not saying she's sick. I'm saying she brings it. Or sees it. Or Mary looked around as if realizing the town was now watching. Things have been strange since she came. Reuben stepped forward, closing the distance with quiet control. His voice remained calm, but every syllable struck like iron on stone. You think she cursed your son? Mary faltered. You think a deaf girl who has done nothing but help nothing but heal is to blame for an illness your boy caught from playing in the creek, barefoot last week? She looked at him, Mary whispered. She saw him, Reuben corrected, the way no one else does. Silas moved to his father's side, fists clenched. Clara Bell emerged from the hardware store, her face pale with fury. Then Iris appeared. She had stepped from behind the corner unseen until that moment. She didn't approach. She didn't flinch. She simply looked at Mary. Not with anger, not with pity, with understanding. She held her gaze long enough for Mary's expression to begin cracking, for her hands to falter at her sides. And then Iris walked forward. Slowly. Deliberately. She took a scrap of paper from her dress pocket, wrote something, and handed it to Mary. The woman stared at it, then read aloud, voice brittle. He will be fine. His lungs are tired, not dying. Breathe for him tonight. He will breathe on his own by morning. Mary blinked. Her lips trembled, but she didn't speak again. Iris turned to Reuben, nodded once, and began walking back toward the wagon. Reuben stood there a moment longer, letting silence reclaim the town square. Then he followed Silas and Clara at his side. No one stopped them. That night, as the sun dropped behind the hills and the cicadas sang their dusk-laden song, Reuben stood on the back porch, arms folded, watching Iris kneel beside the herb bed. She was weeding, calm, unbothered. He joined her quietly. They nearly turned on you, he said. Iris didn't look up. She simply tapped her fingers lightly against the soil. A rhythm, a code. Then she handed him a slip of paper. People hurt what they don't understand. It's fear, not hate. Reuben exhaled slowly. Doesn't make it right. She gave him a small, weary smile, then another note. Neither does hiding. He nodded, sat beside her. I was ready to fight for you today. She wrote one last message. You didn't need to. I stood for myself. But knowing you would, that mattered more. Reuben closed his eyes. The wind whispered across the land, carrying with it the scent of lavender and soil of life, pushing up through hardened places. And he realized then, Iris didn't just listen to pain. She taught others how to face it, with grace, with courage, with silence that wasn't empty but full of meaning. The morning began like any other, the smell of coffee, the creak of wood, as Silas descended the stairs, the steady rhythm of Reuben's boots crossing the floor. Birds called through the cottonwoods, the horses nickered for grain. Only one thing was different. Iris was gone. Not absent from the kitchen or the porch. Gone. No sign of her in the house. Her room was untouched, the bed neatly made. The notebook she always carried was missing. So was her shawl, the light blue one Clara had given her. Reuben stood in the center of the hallway, heart beating louder than he wanted to admit. His eyes scanned every detail, his mind tracing every possibility had she gone for a walk to town. But she never left without a word. Not without a note on the kitchen table. Not without a sign. Silas appeared beside him, eyes wide. She's not here. Reuben shook his head. Silas glanced at the empty coat hook. That's the one she always takes. Reuben grabbed his hat. Saddle up. We're going to town. They split up when they reached the square. Reuben checked the general store. The library, the back alley behind the bakery, where Iris sometimes liked to sit in the shade. Nothing. Clara Bell hadn't seen her since yesterday. Neither had Mary Ledlow, who still hadn't met Reuben's eye since the accusation. The heat climbed steadily through the morning sun, baking the dust into hard clay. By noon, sweat streaked Reuben's back, and his chest tightened with a sense he hadn't felt since the night Abigail died. Not fear. Panic. He found Silas waiting near the water pump, wiping his brow. Anything Reuben asked. Silas shook his head. She's just gone. Reuben looked at the horizon. Flat land stretched for miles in every direction. But something tugged at him, a memory, faint but persistent. The last note Iris had written the night before. Sometimes the wind is the only thing that listens. At the time, he thought it poetic. Now he saw it for what it was, a goodbye, or a cry for help. He rode hard toward the canyon. 10 miles southwest, the land dipped into a cradle of rock and dry grass, where wind carved out whispers and dust made the sky shimmer. It had always been Abigail's favorite place, and Iris had taken to sitting there when she needed space. Reuben reached the top of the ridge just as the sun began its descent. And there she was, a figure seated cross-legged beneath the only tree for miles, a gnarled mesquite that clung to life by roots older than most men in town. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even moving. She simply sat, eyes open, face lifted to the wind. Reuben dismounted slowly, carefully, as if approaching a bird too fragile to catch. He stood a few paces behind her, the wind rustling his shirt. His voice, when it came, was raw. I thought I lost you. Iris turned slightly but didn't smile. She looked tired, not in body, but in spirit. Like something inside her had been weathered thinner than it should be. She reached for her notebook and handed it to him. I didn't want to disappear. I needed to know if I mattered when I wasn't fixing something. Reuben stared at the words. Iris. She held up a hand, then wrote again. All my life, people needed me when they needed me, but only for that. Once the problem was gone, so was I. She didn't weep. She didn't tremble. But the note shook in his hand. I'm not like them, Reuben said softly. Iris wrote again. I believe you. But I had to see what silence felt like when I chose it. Reuben knelt beside her. Iris, he said, voice breaking. You're not here to serve us. You're not here to heal everyone. You're here because this place is better with you in it. Because I am." She turned to him slowly, her eyes unreadable. Then she passed him one final note. "I needed to know you'd come looking." He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply reached out and took her hand. Not as a rescuer, not as a protector, but as a man who had finally understood what it meant to need someone, not for what they could give, but for who they were. They sat there for a long while, the sky turning amber above them, the wind weaving through grass and silence like a hymn. And when they rose to leave, Iris didn't walk behind him. She walked beside him. Back at the ranch, Clara Bell was waiting on the porch with Silas, her arms crossed and eyes narrow. "I'm going to beat you both with a broom," she muttered when they arrived, but her voice cracked. "You scared the life out of that boy." Iris smiled, a real one this time. Silas ran to her, hugging her with all the awkward fierceness of a 13-year-old boy who didn't know how else to say, "I missed you." Inside the house, Reuben sat at the table long after dinner, nursing a coffee gone cold, staring at the last note she'd given him. "I needed to know you'd come looking." He folded it carefully, pressed it into the pages of Abigail's Bible, not to hide it, but to keep it safe. Some words didn't need to be spoken. They just needed to be remembered. It took time for the world to settle again after Iris's return, not because of fanfare, but because something invisible had shifted. Like the quiet after a long drought, when the air no longer holds its breath. Life resumed, but not quite as it had before. There was a softness in the way Reuben moved through the house, now his steps a little slower near her door, his voice a little gentler when calling across the porch. Silas watched her more, not with curiosity anymore, but with respect, the kind a boy offers a person who has walked through something heavy and come out standing. And Iris herself had changed. She no longer floated at the edges of the room. She entered it not loudly, but with presence, with intention. Her silence had grown more powerful, not more distant. The town, too, began to shift in imperceptible ways. It started with Clara Bell, who walked into the Sunday church meeting, placed her black hat on the front pew, and announced she was restarting her reading circle. For everyone, she said, eyes scanning the rows, especially for those who've been unheard for too long. Reuben sat beside Iris, and when the pastor offered the usual closing blessing, he thought for the first time that perhaps it wasn't just formality, that perhaps something unseen was truly being blessed. A week later, Iris walked into the schoolhouse. No one asked her to. No ceremony. No newspaper mention. She simply arrived with Clara carrying a small satchel of books and herbs and sat in the corner while Clara taught. There were 6 children that day, ranging from 7 to 11, squirming in wooden desks and distracted by springtime through the windows. But they all noticed her. At first they whispered. Then one girl, Ellie Mays, got up, walked over to Iris, and placed a crumpled drawing in her lap, a stick figure with wild hair and flowers for hands. Iris smiled, took a scrap of paper, and responded, "Thank you. It's beautiful." She held it up. Ellie beamed. The next day there were 10 students. By the end of the week there were 22. Reuben watched all of it unfold, like someone seeing color return to a painting long faded. He didn't interfere. He didn't guide. He simply built the benches they needed for the growing class, fixed the broken window in the schoolhouse roof, delivered books Clara requested without being asked. But one evening after supper, he stood beside Iris in the garden, handed her a fresh mug of tea, and asked the question that had lingered too long. "Are you happy here?" Iris looked up at him, not surprised, not uncertain. She wrote slowly, carefully. "I feel seen. That's more than I had before." Reuben nodded. Then she added another note. But happiness doesn't come from being seen. It comes from being safe enough to stay. He felt the weight of that sentence settle into his chest. "I want you to stay," he said, voice low. She held his gaze, then reached for a fresh slip of paper. "Then I will." Clara Bell, meanwhile, was already planning more than anyone realized. "You know what that girl needs," she said one evening to Reuben, as they shelled peas on the porch. "A platform. A place to teach others the way she listens." "She's not looking to become a preacher," Reuben said, smirking. "No," Clara agreed. "But she's already a healer, just not the kind we're used to." She pointed toward the hill behind the schoolhouse. "We build a little shelter up there, shade benches, nothing fancy. Call it the listening place. Anyone who wants to speak or not speak can go. Iris can hold a circle. No pressure, just presence." Reuben was quiet for a long while. "Then, you already started drawing it up, haven't you?" Clara grinned. 10 minutes after she came back from that canyon, the first circle at the listening place happened under a sky painted with April light. 17 people came. Not all talked, but everyone stayed. Iris didn't lead. She welcomed. She handed out leaves of lemon balm. She showed a child how to fold a paper into a bird. She passed one slip of paper to an old man who had lost his wife and hadn't spoken in months. "You can sit here and just breathe. That's enough." The man cried, not loudly, not ashamedly, just tears that had waited too long for permission. By the end of the day, someone had hung a wooden sign above the shelter. Iris's Circle. She never claimed the name, but she never took it down either. That night, Reuben sat on the porch steps, watching her brush her fingers over the worn porch railing like it was a familiar hand. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the old photograph of Abigail, faded but cherished. Iris noticed. She stepped closer. He handed it to her. "She's still here," he said. "Not in the way she was, but in what she taught me. How to love someone without needing to own them, without rushing them." Iris traced the edge of the photo, then looked up, wrote something slowly. "Then she must be proud. Because that's what you're doing for me." He didn't answer. He just looked at her. And for the first time, he didn't feel like a man who had lost something. He felt like a man who had found something rare, something soft, steady, and unshakably real. Spring settled over Whispering Creek, like a balm softening the ground and coaxing green from every dry corner. The breeze carried wildflower pollen and laughter from the schoolhouse. Fences needed mending. Chores returned to their rhythms. And somewhere in the midst of all that quiet industry, Reuben Hale began to fall in love, not with a thunderclap, but like dew forming on grass, slowly, invisibly all at once. He hadn't meant for it to happen. He hadn't looked for it. In fact, he'd long assumed that part of him had sealed itself away with Abigail's last breath. But Iris didn't try to enter his heart. She just sat beside it until it unlocked itself. It was in the way she touched the earth with reverence, not bending it to her will, but listening to it, learning from it. The way she looked at Silas not as a boy needing direction, but as a soul forming. The way she turned moments into meaning without a single spoken word. Reuben began to notice her in new ways, how the corners of her eyes crinkled when she was amused, how her fingers moved like a forgotten melody. When she signed, how her silence filled rooms more fully than sound ever could. But it wasn't until the night of the spring bonfire that he understood what had been growing between them. The whole town had gathered behind the chapel, as they did every year, to welcome the new season. There were pies and lanterns, fiddles, and dancing barefoot children running through the grass. Clara Bell brought pickled beets and scolded anyone who didn't try them. Silas stayed glued to the dessert table. Iris arrived in a soft green dress Clara had altered for her modest flowing, edged with hand-sewn violets. She wore her hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck, a few tendrils escaping like ivy from a trellis. She moved through the crowd with unassuming grace, smiling at the children who greeted her with wildflowers and notes. Reuben watched her from the edge of the gathering, one hand wrapped around a mug of cider, the other clenched and still. He wasn't nervous. He was aware of her, of himself, of the breath between them. She found him near the fire as the sun slipped behind the hills. The sky blushed in streaks of orange and lavender. He nodded. She nodded back. He offered her his coat as the wind picked up. She shook her head, but took it anyway. Slipped it on like it belonged to her. They stood there shoulder to shoulder, watching flames leap into the darkening sky. Then she reached into her satchel and passed him a note. "Do you remember the first thing you said to me?" Reuben smiled. "Yeah. I told you no one deserves to be left behind in the heat," she wrote again. "I believed you. But now I know you didn't just mean the heat." He folded the note gently like it was something sacred. She wrote again. "Can I ask you something?" He nodded. She paused, then wrote, "Do you still miss her?" "Your wife," Reuben's breath caught. He looked at the fire, at the silhouettes of children spinning in the shadows, at Silas laughing near the pie table. Then he turned to her. "I do," he said. "But it's not pain anymore. It's presence, like a song I remember by heart." Iris didn't smile. She simply nodded deeply solemnly. Then slowly she reached for his hand. She didn't pull it or hold it tightly. She just placed her palm over his open quiet. He turned his hand and held hers properly. And that was the moment. No declaration. No speech. Just a touch that said, "I see you. I trust you. I choose to stay." They stood that way for a long time, the fire warming their faces, their joined hands grounded in something ancient and honest. Later, walking home beneath a sky stitched with stars, Reuben and Iris said nothing. Silas raced ahead laughing at the moon, his boots kicking up dust. And Reuben thought to himself, this is what resurrection looks like. Not trumpets, not miracles. Just a woman who doesn't speak, a man who had stopped believing, and a boy who still had dreams walking home together under a sky big enough to hold every loss and every beginning. At the front porch, Reuben paused. Iris stepped up beside him. She didn't go inside immediately. Instead, she passed him one final note that night. "You taught me that safety doesn't mean silence. It means being heard without having to shout." He looked at her. Long and true. "I hear you," he said. And she knew he meant all of her, every bruise that had healed without notice, every gift misunderstood, every ounce of worth she had fought to protect. She went inside. Reuben stood on the porch a long while after listening to the wind rustle the cottonwoods and thinking, this is how it begins. Not with falling, but with standing beside someone and realizing you were never truly whole without them. The days that followed the bonfire carried a new kind of stillness, not emptiness, but expectancy, as if the world itself was holding its breath, watching two souls move closer, slower, truer. Reuben Hale had always believed love was something you protected, not pursued. After Abigail's death, he told himself his heart was a house no one would enter again, not because the door was locked, but because the lights had gone out. But Iris, she didn't knock. She simply stood outside quietly until the house lit up on its own. And now, as April leaned into May, Reuben found himself planning not the way a boy dreams of love, but the way a man prepares for something sacred. The idea came on a Thursday. He was repairing the old fence near the western pasture, the sun just starting to crest the horizon, casting golden light over the land. Silas was feeding the horses. Iris was humming faintly, as she swept the porch, her voice so soft it felt like wind moving through pine needles. And in that moment, Reuben realized he didn't want another spring to pass without asking her. Not if she loved him. That part was already clear in the way she watched Silas read aloud, or how her hand lingered on his shoulder when she passed behind him. No, what he wanted to ask was simple. Would she walk with him for the rest of whatever years they had left? The plan was quiet, like her. No grand gestures, no town gathering, just the places that had come to mean something to both of them. He started at the canyon, the one where she had once disappeared. He built a small bench beneath the old mesquite tree, carved it himself, plain but sturdy. On the backrest, with a chisel and careful hands, he inscribed 5 words. "Here I first knew you." Then he rode into town, stopped by Clara Bell's, and asked for her help. "I want it simple," he told her. "But..." "Right." Clara didn't ask questions. She only smiled, the kind of smile that meant she'd known this was coming long before he had. That Saturday, he left a note for Iris on the porch swing, folded neatly. No envelope. "Meet me at the canyon when the sun begins to fall. Wear your walking shoes. I'll be waiting." When she stepped outside and read it, she didn't ask questions either. She simply nodded to herself, to the wind, to something older than both, and went inside to change. The canyon was quiet when she arrived. The sun low, washing the rock in warm light. Shadows long, wind soft. Reuben was already there, standing beside the bench hat in his hand, boots dusty from pacing. She approached slowly, eyes on his. He didn't speak at first. He simply gestured to the bench. She sat. He did too. There was a long moment, not of silence, but of stillness, like the pause before a song begins, where everything matters more because of what's about to be said. Reuben took a breath. Then from his coat pocket he pulled out a small velvet box, opened it. Inside was a ring, simple silver, carved with 2 letters entwined, R and I. No diamond, no jewel, just meaning. He placed it on her palm, not her finger. And beside it, a note he had written in pencil, his handwriting uneven from emotion. "You have already given me life. I'm asking if you'll give me time to keep learning, to keep listening, to keep loving you in every way I know how. Will you marry me, Iris?" She stared at it, then at him. No tears, just radiance. She didn't reach for her notebook. Instead, she reached for his hand, then pressed it to her chest over her heart. Then she nodded once, slowly, deliberately, and mouthed one word. Yes. They stayed there as the sun sank behind the canyon wall, casting everything in gold and shadow. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Love had already said enough. That night, back at the ranch, Clara Bell had arranged a quiet supper, just the 3 of them. There were candles, a pie. Silas trying to act like he hadn't peeked at the ring earlier. After the meal, Reuben lifted his glass. "To Iris," he said. "To the bravest woman I know, and the clearest voice in a world too full of noise." Iris smiled, eyes glistening, then passed him a note under the table. "I don't need to speak to tell you I love you, but I'll spend every day showing you anyway." Reuben read it, folded it carefully, and placed it inside the pocket that held his heartbeat. It wasn't the kind of wedding townsfolk expected. There were no white gowns or violin quartets, no grand invitations or bells. Just word of mouth carried softly through Whispering Creek, like the wind before a gentle rain. "They're getting married," Clara Bell told Mrs. Ledlow at the grocer's. "Out by the cottonwoods," said the barber. "About time," Silas added with a grin, passing the blacksmith. And so, on a golden afternoon in late May, beneath the oldest cottonwood on the Hale property, Reuben and Iris stood hand in hand, surrounded by those who mattered, and a silence so full it felt like music. The tree arched above them like a cathedral made of time and grace. Sunlight slipped through the branches, dappling the ground with gold. The air smelled of wild sage and river mint. It was, as Clara Bell later said, the kind of day God made with a little extra care. There was no officiant in robes, just Clara standing proud and tearful, a book of old poetry clutched in her hands, and her voice firm with joy. "We are here," she began, "not just to witness, but to remember. That love doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits. It heals. It listens." Iris wore a cream dress stitched by hand, hemmed with lavender thread. Her hair fell freely braided only at the temples, a ribbon from Silas tucked gently behind her ear. She carried no bouquet, just Reuben's hand in hers, calloused, warm, honest. Reuben wore his best shirt slightly wrinkled, and boots polished for the first time in years. His coat was left open, as if to say nothing was hidden. They didn't exchange vows aloud. Instead, Iris passed Reuben a folded paper. "I choose you not for what you say, but for how you've always heard me." Reuben read it, his hand steady, then whispered something only she could hear. And she smiled, full and certain, as if the world had just spoken back. Silas stood proudly as best man, his voice cracking as he read a blessing he'd written himself. "I didn't know love could look like this, quiet and safe and strong. I'm glad you found each other. I'm glad I get to stay." There wasn't a dry eye by the time he stepped down. After the ceremony, they didn't walk down an aisle. They simply walked home together side by side, as they always had, with Iris waving softly to the townsfolk who had once misunderstood her, and Reuben holding her hand, like it was a compass that had finally pointed true. The meal was set up under lanterns, strung between barn beams, long wooden tables, roasted chicken, peach pie, laughing children. Stories passed between neighbors like old recipes rediscovered. Mrs. Ledlow brought a gift, a tin box filled with her mother's biscuit mix, and a note that simply read, "I was wrong." Iris smiled and embraced her, not because it was expected, but because forgiveness always had a place at a table like this. Later, Clara rose with her teacup, cleared her throat, and offered the final toast to Iris for teaching us that silence isn't empty, and to Reuben for proving that it's never too late to begin again. As night fell, Reuben and Iris sat on the porch swing, watching stars unfold above them like lanterns in a velvet sky. Silas had gone to bed early, exhausted from dancing and too much lemonade. Reuben turned to Iris. "You know," he said softly, "if someone asked me years ago what love looked like, I would have said something loud, bold, maybe even wild." He smiled. "But I was wrong. It looks like this." Iris leaned into his shoulder. She handed him a final note. "Love is what remains when the world grows quiet." And so they stayed there, not speaking, just rocking gently beneath the wide Texas sky, their silence full of everything they no longer needed to say. Epilogue. Years later. The schoolhouse still stands. The garden still blooms. The cottonwoods still whisper. Children still run barefoot past the Hale Ranch. Sometimes they pause at the bench by the canyon, the one that reads, "Here I first knew you." Couples sit there now, sometimes in silence, sometimes holding hands. And every so often someone leaves behind a note, tucked between the cracks of the wood. Not asking for answers, just knowing that somewhere someone once listened, and it changed everything. Sometimes the quietest stories leave the deepest echo. If this one touched your heart, even just a little, we'd love to know. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city or town in the comments below. It means more than you think. We read every name, every message, and every memory you share. And if you believe in kindness, healing, and love that finds its way through even the hardest silences, consider subscribing to the channel. There's always another story waiting, and we'd be honored to share it with you. From our hearts to yours, thank you for spending your time with us today. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other.